Good evening, folks, and welcome to lesson 24 in our series on the Gospel of Luke. I'd like to start this evening by reading from Psalm 92. Well, not from Psalm 92. I'm reading the whole thing. Turn on another light. I don't care if I look pale and pasty. Psalm 92, which reads, "It is good to give thanks to the Lord, to sing praises to your name, O Most High, to declare your steadfast love in the morning and your faithfulness by night, to the music of the lute and the harp, to the melody of the lyre. For you, O Lord, have made me glad by your work. At the works of your hands I sing for joy. How great are your works, O Lord! Your thoughts are very deep. The stupid man cannot know, the fool cannot understand this, that though the wicked sprout like grass, and all evildoers flourish, they are doomed to destruction forever. But you, O Lord, are on high forever. For behold your enemies, O Lord, behold your enemies shall perish. All evildoers shall be scattered. But you have exalted my horn like that of the wild ox. You have poured over me fresh oil. My eyes have seen the downfall of my enemies. My ears have heard the doom of my evil assailants. The righteous flourish like the palm tree and grow like a cedar in Lebanon. They are planted in the house of the Lord. They flourish in the courts of our God. They still bear fruit in old age. They are ever full of sap and green, to declare that the Lord is upright. He is my rock, and there is no unrighteousness in him." So this evening, we finally are making it into Luke chapter 6. Looking at part 4 of this one section of seven bits of seven independent units that start with a call of a disciple. That's Simon Peter in the beginning of Acts chapter 5. Then have two healing miracles of the demoniac and Simon's mother-in-law. Then have the call of Levi, followed by some discussion about things old and things new. And then this evening, we're looking at two discussions of the Sabbath and what is lawful to do or not lawful to do on the Sabbath. And that's followed by the final call, the call of the 12 apostles. After this, we move into the formal ministry of Jesus, for want of a better way to put it, not that it hasn't already begun. But here now we have Jesus with his group of selected apostles and the other disciples who are with him, going into his intense teaching and the miracles that he will perform and the parables that he's going to give for the next period of time until in chapter 11. Not chapter 11, the later on in Luke, he's going to set his face toward Jerusalem and head toward the inevitability of the cross and the passion that he'll have there. But first, we're going to cover this section here that you can see outlined on your screen. I'm going to read these verses, and then we'll go back and make a few comments. I don't have a bunch of slides tonight. I've been trying to cut back because, well, sometimes time runs away from me and I don't have the time to put the slides together, is really my only excuse. But Luke chapter 6, beginning in verse 1 through verse 16. On a Sabbath, while he was going through the grain fields, his disciples plucked and ate some heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands. But some of the Pharisees said, "Why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath?" And Jesus answered them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and also gave it to those with him? And he said to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." On another Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching, and a man was there whose right hand was withered. And the scribes and the Pharisees watched him to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath, so that they might find a reason to accuse him. But he knew their thoughts, and he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come and stand here." And he rose and stood there. And Jesus said to them, "I ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to destroy it?" And after looking around at them all, he said to him, "Stretch out your hand." And he did so, and his hand was restored. But they were filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. In these days he went out to the mountain to pray, and all night he continued in prayer to God. And when day came, he called his disciples and chose from them 12, whom he named apostles: Simon, whom he named Peter, and Andrew his brother, and James and John, and Philip, and Bartholomew, and Matthew, and Thomas, and James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon, who was called the Zealot, and Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. And so we come into this section where we're going to be discussing the Sabbath. If I were to ask you which of the 10 commandments was the most important from the perspective of the Jews, you could make an argument. And I understand they all have similar gravity, but you could make an argument that the Sabbath, the commandment to keep the Sabbath, was the one that was most important. The prophets talk about it an awful lot, especially when we find that God is angry with the behavior of either Israel or Judah. Sabbath keeping is one of the first things that goes by the wayside. It's not necessarily idolatry, but Sabbath keeping seems to be an issue that God takes up with Israel often. And one of the writers I was reading said that more than any other, more than circumcision, Sabbath defines Judaism, because not all Jews are circumcised, but all Jews do keep the Sabbath. All faithful Jews do keep the Sabbath. And it became such a weighty and important thing for the Jews that the period of the Pharisees, starting shortly after the Maccabean revolt, and the school of the scribes began to compile lists of things that violated the Sabbath. They wanted to come up with an answer for every possibility, which is difficult to do when you consider human behavior, because humans are liable to do things that you can't predict. But the Jews wanted very much to put together a lengthy list of every possible thing that human beings could do and decide whether or not these things were permitted on the Sabbath. And so they came up with 2 volumes in the Mishnah, the Shabbat, and the other one whose name escapes me. I have it written down here someplace, but it's really not important. They came up with 2 volumes, more than any other volume of regulations that they have, of things you can and cannot do on the Sabbath. In the ancient Near East, the religious people, tended to venerate sacred places or sacred objects. They would set up an idol, or they would set up a high place, an altar or a shrine on top of a hill, and that was a sacred place to them. It was a thing that was holy. The Jews venerated time because the Sabbath was holy. God tells the Israelites in Exodus chapter 20 to remember the Sabbath and to keep it holy. And so they revered the time of the Sabbath, and they piled up this great weight of laws. The Pharisees set up what they described as a fence around the law. Their interpretive decisions on how to apply the law that comprised many, many volumes. And the idea behind this was to set preventive measures in place to prevent people from actually breaking the law. If we put enough regulations on it, people will stay away. We can keep people from crossing over that threshold where they won't break the law. They might break some of these little regulations, but they won't have actually gotten to the commandment, which is weighty and has importance. And even the rabbis admitted that the regulations that they'd come up with, for Sabbath regulations, the Sabbat volume and the Erubin volume, they admit the rules about the Sabbath, festal offerings, and sacrifice are as mountains hanging by a hair. Prescription is scanty and the rules are many. And For example, the Mishnah, the Shabbat volume lists 39 classes of behavior or 39 classes of work that profane the Sabbath. Examples would include, if you are going to write something, writing more than one letter is work. If you're sewing something, sewing more than one stitch is work, and so it is prohibited on the Sabbath. Those are some of the minutiae that they said, this breaks the Sabbath. This transgresses the law of God if you do these things. And so we have the disciples here. This is not the 12 apostles. This is the group of disciples that are around Jesus. They're going through a grain field, and as is permitted in Deuteronomy 23, verse 25, it says, if you go into your neighbor's standing grain, you may pluck the ears with your hand, but you shall not put a sickle to your neighbor's standing grain. Later rabbinic tradition is going to decree that this is against Sabbath law. They have violated the Sabbath. In fact, they are guilty of reaping, they're guilty of threshing, they're guilty of winnowing, and they could possibly, because they're rubbing the grain in their hands to remove the husks, which is both threshing and winnowing, because they're letting the chaff go and they're eating the grain, could possibly be interpreted as grinding. They're grinding the grain with their hands. They're working. And so the question that they ask of Jesus is, why are you doing, actually they're asking the disciples, but why are you doing, Jesus is going to answer for them, taking responsibility for their behavior. Why are you doing what is unlawful to do on the Sabbath? The Sabbath is the only one of the 10 commandments that was instituted by God at creation. In Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 to 3, God rests from his labor and he blesses the seventh day. And so it's an order of creation. It's something the Jews took very seriously. For Israel, it was a time to set Israel not only in a right relationship with God, but also in a right relationship with others. Because if you are a homeowner and you have servants, not only do you not do any work, but the servants don't do any work, nor do your animals do any work. And in fact, it's time for the vegetation to get rest, because you can't go out and harvest. You can't go out and cut down your grain. You can't go out and harvest your apple tree or whatever. But it is lawful, but not according to the Pharisees. It's lawful for somebody to pluck a handful of grain and eat it. That's not reaping. It's not preparing food. It is certainly not threshing and winnowing and perhaps grinding. So they ask him, why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? It's addressed to the disciples, but it's Jesus who answers, underscoring the responsibility of Jesus or the master for his disciples. And he answers with the question, have you not read? Have you not read of this account of David? Which suggests that they have read, but they haven't understood. The essence of Jesus' response here is that it is he and not these Pharisees who understand the significance of Scripture. Well, Jesus is the author of Scripture, or he's the source of it, at least. He knows the Scripture better than the Pharisees know. And so he cites this precedent in 1 Samuel chapter 21, verses 1 through 6. David is a fugitive. He's fleeing from Saul, and he enters the house of God in search of food. And the bread that Jesus is referring to are the 12 loaves of showbread that were placed on the altar, or on the table rather, Sabbath by Sabbath. So they'd bake the loaves fresh, they'd put them on the table on the Sabbath, and they'd remove the old ones. And the old ones were food for the priests to eat. And it is a precedent that is set in place by God in Leviticus chapter 24 and verses 5 through 9. The bread for the tabernacle. You shall take fine flour and bake 12 loaves from it. 2/10 of an ephah shall be in each loaf, which one of the writers I read, and I wasn't able to verify it elsewhere, said it's about 6.5 pounds of flour. So that's a big loaf of bread that they're baking. You shall set them in 2 piles, 6 in a pile, on the table of pure gold before the Lord. And you shall put pure frankincense on each pile, that it may go with the bread as a memorial portion, as a food offering to the Lord. Every Sabbath day, Aaron shall arrange it before the Lord regularly. It is from the people of Israel as a covenant forever, and it shall be for Aaron and his sons, and they shall eat it in a holy place, since it is for him a most holy portion out of the Lord's food offerings, a perpetual due. And so this was a regulation set in place by God. It is I don't want to call it a ceremonial command, but I'm going to call it a ceremonial command that this bread is for the priests. And David and his men come in hunger and asks the priests, what do you have that you can set before us? And they say, there's nothing here except for the showbread. And so they have an exchange, and David ends up getting 5 loaves of the bread, and he and his men eat. Jesus is using this not as an excuse for his actions, but rather as a precedent for them. That let me get to the next slide. I think it helps explain it a little bit better. David is not condemned for what he does here. And if he has a right to set aside a divinely ordained ceremonial provision when necessity demanded it, Jesus says here, have you not read what David did when he was hungry and those who were with him? It was hunger that necessitated it. It was hunger that prompted David's actions. Then would not David's exalted antitype, that's Jesus, David is the type of Messiah, Jesus is the realization of it, have a right under similar conditions of need to set aside a totally unwarranted man-made regulation? See, there's a difference between what the Pharisees are accusing Jesus of doing and what Jesus says David did. David sets aside a commandment that was put in place by God. It's clearly stated there in Leviticus, as I read for you. Jesus, in the actions of his disciples, they're setting aside a tradition of the Pharisees. The Pharisees are taking their tradition and making it equal to the law, saying that the traditions, if you violate the traditions, you violated the law and you're under guilt. When they have no basis for it. Even their own rabbis admitted there was no basis for the idea that, or all these regulations rather, that they were heaping on top of the Sabbath and on some of the festivals, because the scripture is brief. And it's interesting what Jesus says in Mark's account of this incident, when he says that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Even the rabbis agreed with this point. One of them wrote, the Sabbath is handed over to you, not you are handed over to the Sabbath. In other words, the Sabbath was made by God. It was ordained by God as a commandment. It was supposed to be a blessing for the people. This time of rest, this time of recuperation, this time of reflection, this time of worship. Here is a day that you set aside, that you set apart from your normal routines, and you receive what you have with thanksgiving, and you bless and honor God for it. And you rest. It was meant to be a blessing. The Pharisees, I wrote it down here in this last point. Ritual needs to give way to charity. The divine character of the law is best seen when it is lovable. And what I mean by lovable is the psalmist writes in Psalm 119, oh, how I love thy law. The law was designed to protect Israel, yes, but it was designed also to be a guidance. Moses says in Deuteronomy, these words that I've given you, you need to pay attention to them, because these words are your life. They're important. But the law was never meant to be this odious burden that just ground people down and made them feel bad about all these little regulations that we can't possibly memorize, that we're continually violating without knowing it. And you could develop a defeatist attitude by it. The Pharisees had taken what God had ordained through Moses for the people and had made it an iron taskmaster and made it rigorous and made it punishing and looked down on everybody who couldn't live up to the standards of holiness that they had set for themselves. Problem was that their righteousness was self-righteousness. It was not the righteousness that comes either by loving God or by following the law or by both. So the Sabbath is the Sabbath is the tradition here. Jesus sets it aside, and one might ask, well, by what authority is Jesus doing this? And he makes this statement in verse 5, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. The Son of Man has lordship over the Sabbath. It's not given to any mere human being to set aside an order of creation. If Bill Moore went out to the ocean and decided, I'm tired of the tide, I'm going to issue a decree that the tide will forever stop, does Bill Moore have authority to set aside what God has created? Of course he doesn't. No mere human being can do that. No more than Peter Archibald can say, I'm going to make it so that the sun never rises again. I'm going to stop the rotation of the planet. He can't do that. We don't have that authority. So if human beings can't set aside an order of creation, then the Son of Man, who has the authority to forgive sins, Jesus says in Luke chapter 5, verse 24, which is something that belongs exclusively to God, then the Son of Man is something more than a mere human being. Jesus is more than just a man. He is God in flesh. He is God made flesh. He's no mere human being to be beholden to the Pharisees' traditions. Jesus, in saying that he's Son of Man, is Lord over the Sabbath. In Matthew, we're going to look at at the end here when we get to the application. Jesus also in this same instance says that, go and learn what this is mean. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. Actually, that might apply to the healing of the man with the withered hand. It's in Matthew chapter 9. Actually, it's in the call of Matthew. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, Matthew chapter 9, verse 13, but it's also in chapter 12. Yeah, it's in chapter 12, in the account of Jesus using the example of David in chapter 12 and verse 7. If you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. If Jesus and his disciples are guilty of an infraction of the Sabbath, then so was David guilty of transgressing the law when he took the bread of the presence from the priests. The priest gave it to him. He didn't take it by force, but they gave him the bread, and he ate it and gave it to his men to eat. Jesus is saying, you can't condemn me without condemning David. If David is guiltless, then so am I guiltless. And it doesn't matter anyway, because I'm Lord over the Sabbath, and your regulations are man-made regulations, and they have absolutely no binding. And so we move from that instance to the second question of the Sabbath, this man who is there with the withered hand on another Sabbath, not necessarily the next Sabbath. It could have been. Luke is in specific about the time. And it's interesting that Luke mentions that the man who is there, his right hand is the hand that is withered. It would be most likely his dominant hand. We don't know if the man was left-handed or right-handed, but since most people are right-handed, you can make an assumption that this man is also right-handed. And so he had made his livelihood with his right hand. I'll refer you to something else in a couple of minutes, that a tradition about him that seems to suggest that he made his living with his right hand. And we're told that the scribes and the Pharisees are watching Jesus to see if he's going to heal. Because, according to Sabbath tradition, healing was not permitted on the Sabbath except to save a life. In the volume Shabbat 22 and verse 6, forbids straightening a deformed body or setting a broken limb. Can you imagine breaking your arm just as the Sabbath begins and being told, no, we can't fix that until the Sabbath is ended. You'll just have to suffer through it. And the religious authorities would have been fine saying that. They are fine with this man being in the condition that he is in, and whether they brought him here or it's just coincidence that he has shown up or what, they're using this man. They don't see a human being with a need. They see a means by which they might entrap Jesus. And we'll look at that a little bit more as we get further down through this. Withered hands are understood to be a punishment by God. If you look at 1 Kings chapter 13, not 2 Kings, that's why I can't find it. The numbers 1 and 2 look very much alike. They're very close together, and that's why I mix them up sometimes, which might explain why I am not a bookkeeper, because me and math do not get along. In 2 Kings chapter 13, beginning in verse 1, behold, a man of God came out of Judah by the word of the Lord to Bethel. Jeroboam was standing by the altar. This is not the altar at Jerusalem. This is the altar at Dan. He's standing by the altar to make offerings, and the man cried out against the altar by the word of the Lord and said, O altar, altar, thus says the Lord, behold, a son shall be born to the house of David, Josiah by name, one of two individuals named directly in prophecy, Cyrus of Persia being the second. That comes immediately to mind. Josiah by name, he shall sacrifice on you the priests of the high places who make offerings on you, and whom human bones shall be burned on you. And he gave a sign the same day, saying, this is a sign that the Lord has spoken. Behold, the altar shall be torn down, and the ashes that are on it shall be poured out. And when the king heard the saying of the man of God, which he cried against the altar at Bethel, Jeroboam stretched out his hand from the altar, saying, seize him. And his hand, which he stretched out against him, dried up, so that he could not draw it back. And the altar was torn down, and the ashes poured out from the altar, according to the sign of the man of God had given by the word of the Lord. So here's the punishment of God. Jeroboam points at the prophet and says, seize that man. And God strikes him. And his hand is dried up so that he can't draw it back. The prophet ends up restoring it in that passage, but it was seen as a punishment by God. And so here's this man who has a withered hand, and the Pharisees are watching out of the corner of their eye. This is the term that is used in Greek implies that their scrutiny is not impartial. It has a sinister overtone. It's sort of like they're watching covertly to see what's going to happen. And the intent that they have is to see if Jesus is going to heal this man so that they might accuse him. They have an agenda for being there. They're not there to listen to Jesus. They're not there to be instructed by Jesus. They're there simply to trap Jesus. And Jesus knows their thoughts. Also in chapter 5, verse 22, and the other verses that you see there. The word that's used for thoughts there, it's used 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 times in Luke, beyond including the 3 that I have listed there, and chapter 2, verse 35. It means thoughts that are unsettling or offensive, thoughts that can give offense. And so Jesus knows their thoughts, and he asks the question, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to destroy it? And the irony is that Jesus knows that the Pharisees are there to see if he's going to heal this man so that they might have cause to destroy Jesus. And so the question really is double-pronged. Is it lawful to destroy, to do this thing that is in your heart to do? Is it lawful for you to have this scheme in your heart on the Sabbath? And of course, they don't answer him. They look around at each other, and Jesus looks around at them. Mark says that Jesus looked around in anger because they were so stubborn in their hearts. And prior to this, they were probably thinking to themselves that their motives and secrets were hidden. Jesus is open. Jesus does not hide things. He knows that they want to trap him, but he doesn't back away. Instead, he turns to the man and he puts the man in the center. For the Pharisees, the issue that is at center is, will Jesus heal? For Jesus, the issue is, here's a man who needs help. Which is the greater gravity? Is it more important to let this man suffer another day in the condition that he's in? It's not life-threatening condition. So according to their tradition, it's not lawful for Jesus to heal him. Or should Jesus extend mercy to him? One of the commentators I read wrote that which honors God cannot dishonor my neighbor. That which leaves my neighbor in his suffering can only be evil. Not even on the Sabbath, or perhaps especially on the Sabbath, can there be a comfortable neutrality that is content to define one's responsibilities negatively in terms of what is not to be done. Imagine it is the Sabbath day, and let me pick on somebody here. And I'll pick on Gail. Gail has fallen down, and she can't get up under her own power. Am I to sit there and debate, is it legal, is it lawful for me to help her up? Or should I leave her down there until the sun has set and then I can help her up? And can you imagine forming a committee that's going to stand around her and question the legality of extending aid to a human being who is in need? That's essentially what the Pharisees are doing. They've made their decision that it's not lawful to help this man. So Jesus tells the man, stand there in the center of the crowd here. And it's interesting that Jerome, who was one of the late church fathers, between the year 347 and 420 he lived, he wrote a commentary on the Gospel of Matthew in which he records a tradition that the man spoke to Jesus and made the statement that he was a stonemason who had injured his hand at his work, and he pleaded for mercy from Jesus so that he would not be dishonored, or that he would not have to continue dishonoring himself by begging bread. The Pharisees are quite content to leave him as he is. Jesus looks at the man and sees, here's someone who needs to be saved. Here is an individual who is in need and needs rescue. One writer said that the test of all theology and morality is passed or failed by one's response to the weakest and most defenseless members of society. For Jesus, the call of God presents itself urgently in the plight of the man with the shriveled hand. That's from Edwards in the Pillar Commentary on Luke. And I like the point that he makes there. The Pharisees aren't concerned with the weakest members of society. They're not concerned with those who are suffering. They're more concerned with proving themselves righteous, which I can't go back to the committee that's standing over Gail as she's lying there on the floor. And can you imagine us feeling smug that we're being righteous by not helping this fallen woman back to her feet? Which is ridiculous. But the Pharisees are quite content to leave the man as he is. And so notice what Jesus does. Does he work on the Sabbath? He says to the man, reach out your hand, stretch forth your hand. Now the man faces a decision of faith. People who have a deformity would tend to want to hide that deformity. And so Jesus, by asking him to stretch it out, is asking him to expose that which he probably wants to keep hidden. One writer that I was reading said, faith is a risk that Jesus is worthy of trust when no other hope can be trusted. We need to expose our weakness to Jesus before he can heal it. In other words, we need to come to Jesus confessing that we're sinners. Nobody really likes to do that. I don't want to confess that I have weakness, that I have sinned, that I have fallen short, because I want to be that self-made man. Well, I can't. I have to expose that weakness to Jesus in trust that he's able to heal it. So the man stretches forth his hand, and his hand is restored. Could the Pharisees prove by that Jesus had healed the man? All Jesus said was, stretch out your hand. The man stretches out his hand, and his hand is healed. Jesus doesn't touch him. Jesus doesn't recite an incantation. He doesn't stand up and wave his hands and call on the name of the Lord. He doesn't go out and sacrifice a lamb or anything and pray for the man's restoration. He tells the man, stretch out your hand. And the man, in faith, stretches out his hand. The Pharisees don't respond very well to this, do they? Verse 11 says, they were filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. The Greek word anoios, meaning mindless rage. They are so angry they can't think straight. I don't know if they're angry because their clever trap has been foiled, or if they're angry because Jesus has healed this man, even though he didn't work to do it. He extended mercy to this human being. Yet, and they know that God does not work through sinners. That's one of the basic tenets of the Pharisees. God does not hear or work through sinners. And yet here they witness a healing on the Sabbath day. And they are so stubborn and so set in the old that they cannot recognize the new order that Jesus is ushering in. You remember last week we were talking about the old and the new, the old cloth and the new cloth that can't mix together, the new wine that cannot be poured into the old wineskins lest the wineskins burst. And he ends that little parable by saying in verse 39 of chapter 5, no one after drinking old wine desires new, for he says the old is good. That's the Pharisees. They've drunk the old wine and they've said the old is good. Our tradition, our teachings, our prescriptions and tenets and our interpretation of the law is sufficient. It's good. And we are going to cling to it tenaciously, despite the evidence of their eyes. where the man reaches out his hand and it's restored right in front of them. They can't deny the miracle that took place. And yet for them, it violated the Sabbath. It has to set up this resonance, or this ricochet, or this echo in their minds, that here a man who broke Sabbath law according to their way of thinking was able to work a miracle. How does that work? Because that means he's a sinner, and yet a miracle happened somehow. That had to confound them. And so this discussion that they're having, they discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. Luke says earlier in verse 2, some of the Pharisees said, "Why are you doing what is not lawful to do?" Luke does not, with a single brush, paint all the Pharisees as bad. There will be division among even the Pharisees concerning Jesus. And that comes out a little bit in the choosing of the 12 in verses 12 and following, or rather, I'm implying it. So it's not explicitly stated here, but I'm implying it from what what takes place here with Jesus and the choosing of the 12. Those days he went out to the mountain to pray, and all night he continued in prayer to God. There is no other recording of such a sustained period of prayer attributed to Jesus. Jesus spends the night discussing with his Father. He's got an unknown number of disciples that he has here to choose from. It continues to expand as Luke is writing. And I don't know if I put that in. I don't think I put that in anywhere in the slides, that he goes from 12 here to 72 a little bit later on in Luke. And then in Acts chapter 1, we have 120 that are gathered together. And it's from those people that the 11 apostles choose a replacement for Judas Iscariot, who had betrayed Jesus and then committed suicide. This period of prayer, though, becomes an example for the church in the decisions that the church faces. In Acts chapter 1, verse 24, the appointment of the replacement for Judas was done so with prayer. In Acts chapter 6, verse 6, the appointing of the first deacons was done so with prayer. In Acts 13, verses 2 and 3, appointing Paul and Barnabas and Saul at that time to the first mission trip was also done with prayer. And the appointing of the elders in every church in Acts 14, verse 23 was done with prayer and fasting. So prayer is important. We don't just decide to set somebody in charge of something within the church willy-nilly. It's a prayerful time. Both the individual who is to be appointed to the role needs to spend time in prayer, and the elders, or those who are appointing the individual, also need to spend time in prayer, making sure that this is what God wills. And so we get this example from Jesus. It's interesting, when you look at this list, there were no qualifications. Nobody filled out an application to be a disciple of Jesus. There's no conditions such as merit or education or ability. If you were Jesus, would you have chosen these same men? Well, perhaps it's a loaded question. You probably would have, because Jesus did it. And if you were Jesus, you would do what Jesus would do. But if you were you, which you are, would these be the individuals you chose? They're rough men. They're commoners. You have Matthew, a tax collector. You have Simon, who is a zealot, the militant arm of Judaism that wants to overthrow everything Roman. And, I can picture Jesus having to separate him and Matthew more than once as Simon's trying to kill Matthew, because he was a tax collector and a traitor to Judaism. Jesus chose the man who was going to betray him. That had to be a hard choice. at least to my way of thinking. That had to be a hard thing to do. And yet Jesus chooses Judas Iscariot, I don't think for the purpose of betraying him, but he knew that Judas would become the one who did betray him. The title that he accords to them here, apostle, he names them apostles, indicates a function, the one who is sent out, rather than an honor. It's a position of service rather than a position of power. And you see that in Paul's writings. Paul, who is so reluctant to come to Corinth and exercise his apostolic authority to set them straight, he doesn't want to do that because it's not a position of going in and beating people over the head. I don't think there should be any office within the church that one of the functions of it is to beat people over the head. We need to meet with one another and embrace one another in love, not grind each other down. Christianity is difficult enough without us trying to drag others down and make it more difficult for them to walk in a godly way. That's my personal soapbox, and I will get off of it. But it's interesting that not all the Pharisees were hostile to Jesus, and Luke will point that out. But not all disciples or apostles were faithful to Jesus. And I think that's still true today. We don't have apostles today. No one who was alive and was witness to the ministry of Jesus from the baptism of John onward, which is what is set forth in Acts chapter 1 as a criteria for an apostle. But we're all disciples, and we all have our moments of faithfulness, and we all have our moments of weakness. Hopefully none so great as Judas, though I would say every time we deny Jesus, we are betraying him in a manner of speaking. Thankfully, God extends the grace and mercy and allows us to come to him once again and say, I was weak. Here's my weakness. Help me through it. Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. I love that statement of that man in the Gospel of Mark. And so I want to look at two sides of a coin here in the application. A quote from Pascal, and the next slide is a quote from somebody else. Men never do evil so completely and cheerfully as when they do it from religious conviction. Do you agree or disagree with that statement? And I'm going to unmute everybody so that you can chime in. I'm hitting you with a cold. I've had time to think on it, so it's probably an unfair question to throw at you like this. Do people do evil out of religious conviction? Still.
That's a different question than they never do it so evil and so completely and cheerfully.
Well, Pascal was a little bit smug in his.
I mean, there are a lot of people that do evil in the name of religion, and have in the past. I mean, it's been historical, and if nothing else, history repeats itself.
Yes.
I mean, you look at the Middle Ages. There was tons of persecution then. You look at when the United States was just beginning, and they had certain trials in Massachusetts, and that was all done under the bane of religious.
Oh, the witches, Salem's witch trial.
Yeah, but I mean, it wasn't just witches that they persecuted.
Right.
You know, they persecuted a lot of people.
I think of the life of William Tyndale, who was trying to translate the Bible into English, and the efforts of the then church that was trying to thwart those efforts. And if you were found in possession of a copy of the Bible in English or the New Testament in English, they would burn you. And the people who were doing this did it fully convinced that they were in the right. Even Paul, when he's making his defense before Agrippa, says, I did the things I did with a clear conscience toward God. The stoning, he thought the Christians needed to be stoned to death, and I don't know that he was cheerfully doing it, but he certainly did it out of a conviction that this was the right thing to do.
That goes along with the statement, God knows your heart, you know, so
Yes.
God knows what was going on in their hearts and their minds. We don't, but God does.
So the flip side of that coin, the other quote that I have, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, by some guy named Jesus of Nazareth, recorded in Matthew chapter 12, verse 7. How does that statement apply to us?
Say it again.
I desire mercy and not sacrifice. How does that apply to us?
There's context I'm missing on this. So.
It was in the context was the disciples plucking the grain as they're going through the fields. And the other context was, the other context of Matthew, which is in chapter 9, is when Jesus is at the house of Matthew. Matthew's throwing the feast for him, and Jesus is reclining at table with the tax collectors and sinners, and the Pharisees are sort of scandalized by it. Those are your two contexts.
Because I'm trying to think, because he does actually ask us to sacrifice, take up my cross. So
Yep.
I'm trying to figure out what sacrifice is he talking about here.
I think in the context, and if you go back to Hosea, it's the ritual and rigorous law keeping versus extending mercy towards one's fellow man.
As has been mentioned before, it really is all about the heart. So it's like, like we were talking about David and his mighty men. Yes, people sacrificed for those loaves to be made, but it's God who decides how that's being used. And it's not our call to say, well, that's not what that sacrifice was for.
I think of who do we invite to come to services? There was this comes to my mind because a couple of years ago, I was working with a guy at work at the office, former deadhead, very, very worldly individual, had made a lot of changes in his life and had given up following the Grateful Dead around, but still was living very much the hippie lifestyle. And I invited him and his wife to come to services. I'd invited them several times. I think they finally came the one time, if my memory serves right. Well, he passed away this morning. And we were talking about it in the office, and I was talking about it later this evening with Katie, and saying that, yeah, he'd made a lot of changes in his life, but he hadn't made the one that was the most important change.
Right.
Is that the sort of person that we should be extending mercy to and bringing into the fold? I think yes.
Of course.
I think God's mercy is for everyone, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I am not the judge of who is fitting for the gospel message and who is not. I don't know if that's an application of this verse, though. I think I may have gotten off on a tangent. I tend to do that. Yes.
I was thinking that this was in accordance with Old Testament, where they had all the sacrifices.
It is, yes.
And Jesus became the sacrifice, the only sacrifice that God would accept for all of our sin. right? I
gives it,
mean,
yes.
we could
and-
kill all the, the animals in the world and it wouldn't take away one of our sins.
No, it wouldn't.
But
And Jesus
Jesus
gives
was
us the
willing
one
to give
commandment.
his life. So of course we should practice giving mercy to others.
Right.
Was it that Samuel says to Saul when Saul does the sacrifice?
That it's very similar. I think it's worded since 1 Samuel 15 and verse 22, as the Lord is great a delight in burnt offering and sacrifice, as in obeying the voice of the Lord. Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, to listen than the fat of rams. So it's a very similar phrase, yes. Jesus gives us the one commandment to love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. Jesus loved those on the fringes.
Yeah.
He loved those who were the outsiders, at least from the perspective of the Pharisees. And he makes them insiders when they come to him and they obey and they confess their sin. I know that I need to have more of the heart of Jesus in my own life. I'm perhaps not the only one. And if I am the only one, then one of you guys can teach this class next week. And next week, we're going to be looking at Luke chapter 6, verses 17 to 49, part 1. Okay, I'm qualifying that right now, part 1. I don't think we will be getting through that as much, or at least not in one lesson. Shannon says, I'd rather my kids do the right thing and not be grounded. God would rather mercy and not the need for sacrifice. I think God is pleased when we show mercy one to another.
Yes.
Even if we have the right to get our noses out of joint and take offense. But
Because it's easier to get all out of joint and take offense than it is to show love and affection when you're angry.
it is, yes.
Yep.
The thing I mentioned last week, that the grumbling of the Pharisees comes from grumbling is normally the practice of those who consider that due regard has not been paid to them, or who think that their earthbound sense of what is fitting has been violated. I think sometimes I need to reevaluate what I think is offensive.
I think the same thing. I was just kind of thinking that we kind of been told that how we judge others is how we're going to be judged.
Yes.
And the question is, are we willing to? Do we really think we made up to the standards that we set?
Yeah, I'm not sure I want to be judged with all of the measures that I have judged others. And it's an area in which I need to grow, and I'm sure others need to grow as well. This seems to be a country where we are very much quick to be offended by this or that statement or this or that movement or this or that idea or this or that ism, if you want to put it that way. And perhaps we need to stop looking at what are my rights and ask myself, well, how are my actions impacting my brothers or my sisters? What can I do to serve them? Rather than analyze their lives, or be one of the Pharisees who's sitting there waiting to see, will you do this thing that I think you're going to do so that I might have a reason to accuse you?
Right.
Which is something that Jesus is pointing at. Let me stop the recording.